my loves, welcome back. We're going to be doing my July books for you today, which I am really excited about. It's very Morrison heavy, so get ready. This is my big old pile today. We're missing one book, which I read digitally, but other than that, that's the pile. And our book club book for August is In Ascension by Martin McInnes. I try and keep people vaguely updated on Instagram if you do want to keep updated. I'm really excited about In Ascension. I read it in June. I'm going to reread it this month and I cannot wait to discuss it with book club. I'm really interested to see what people thought of it. We've also decided our book club books for September and October. So we've got The Fawn by Magda Sabo in September and we've got Poor Things by Alistair Gray in October. So moving on to our July book club pick, which was Beloved by Toni Morrison. This was a reread for me. I read it about 10 years ago, I want to say, probably a bit less actually. But anyway, and I have to say it was a really rewarding second read. The first time I found it very challenging, quite difficult to kind of understand what was going on. And the second time round, I really could appreciate what Morrison is doing in this book. Not to mention, of course, I've been reading a lot of Morrison this year, so I am much more familiar with her style. I think this is the first book of hers that I read. So yeah, I'm much more familiar with how her books work. And one of the things to note about her books, it happens in a lot of her books, is that she kind of places you in the middle of events and she references things that you are not going to know about very early on in the book. And slowly reveals over the course of the book the full plot line. So in many ways, reading her books is a little bit like unraveling a mystery, and this book is no exception. Now, this book is not an easy read for multiple reasons. It's not easy emotionally, it's not easy just on a text level. It is more challenging even than other Morrison books. All of them make the reader work to some extent, but this one particularly so. It follows Seth, a formerly enslaved woman, and her family living in Cincinnati in Ohio in the aftermath of the American Civil War. But it also works on two timelines, so it's also describing what happened to Seth when she was enslaved. The book opens describing how the house she lives in is haunted by the ghost of one of her daughters, a baby ghost, and this kind of the strange equilibrium of the house is upturned by the arrival of Paul D, who lived with Seth where she was enslaved. It's called Sweet Home. So they're both from Sweet Home essentially, and he turns up after, I can't remember if it's a couple of decades, something like that. Turns up on her doorstep after many, many years of wandering, and he ends up staying. And this creates upheaval within the household. So Seth has one living daughter still living with her. She also has two living sons who have been driven away by the ghost and the haunting. And Paul D's arrival brings up a lot of memories of the past, and the novel is kind of a working through of some of that trauma and the coming to light of a lot of very difficult, painful past. If you have any concerns at all, please look at the content warnings for this one on Storygraph, because it is very disturbing at points and yeah, just very unsettling. I wouldn't say it was like very scary. I know it's about a haunted house essentially, but it's not super scary, but it's definitely uncanny. As I said, you as the reader are kind of tasked with putting together all of the different events of the novel, the two different timelines, how they work together, but also the prose. I always describe Morrison's prose as thick. You know, it's dense and lyrical, but not in a flowery, floaty way. You know, it's thick like poetry, kind of dense. Particularly so in this book, even compared to some of her other novels. It's dreamlike, coming on for nightmarish. And she also moves, I forgot that she actually moves through a lot of different modes in this book. We get different people's first person perspectives, we get third person, we get a section where it almost reads like prose poetry. So yeah, we're moving a lot in the novel. Also, she'll move between the timelines, sometimes sentence to sentence with very little signposting. So it's really good to read carefully for that. And the best way I find to read Morrison is to note down things that you think are confusing, you don't think you fully understand yet, you're not meant to understand yet, either mentally or literally, and then to allow Morrison to piece it together for you. It helps demonstrate the mastery of Morrison's work as well when you do something like that, because you can really see how she pulls all the threads of the storyline together. I read this one over a couple of days, so I was very intensely reading it. I think that really helped because I got the flow of it a little bit more. I remember saying that about Paradise as well, which I read this year. You need to read them quite quickly just so you don't lose the thread of what's happening and the power and the movement of the storyline. So this may seem like a lot of hard work, but it is worth it. Morrison is just one of the best writers ever to exist, in my opinion, and reading a lot of her work back to back this year has helped demonstrate that to me. She was truly, one of a kind, and she is well worth reading, and this book is one of her masterpieces. I have to say I probably didn't enjoy it. I mean, it's not to be enjoyed, to be honest. It is a very difficult tale about slavery, about the Civil War. It's not necessarily meant to be enjoyed, but I didn't sort of flow with it quite as well as I did with Paradise or Sula. This is more a novel to kind of admire, step back and admire. But yes, the book's treatment of slavery is probably one of the best ever in fiction. It's so nuanced, layered, complex, particularly in the depiction of Sweet Home, in all the different perspectives that you get. It's really, really interesting. And it's hard work because it's meant to be hard work. It's meant to be hard to come to terms with the memories that Seth and her family and Paul D have to come to terms with. It's hard to get into these perspectives. It's especially difficult, obviously, for white readers, as it should be, or readers that aren't part of the African American community. She's really writing within and to that culture, and it makes you work because you are supposed to work to fully get to grips with this novel. One thing I love with Morrison is that she's just made to be analysed. Every word, every image, every sentence, everything is so considered. The plot, the structure, the form, everything is so carefully considered that it does make it a joy to analyse and to dive into. As a lover of literature, her work is just full to the brim with wonderful things to discover. Reading it with book club really helped deepen my understanding of this book. Thank you so much to everyone who came and discussed this with me. And again, it is really rewarding on a second read. I think in general, Morrison's work really rewards multiple readings. If you've tried this one before and not really got to grips with it, I really recommend trying it again. It really will make you a different kind of reader, I think, in a challenging, difficult way, but I think it's really worth doing. But I would say read another of Morrison's novels first. Don't dive in with this one if you are interested. I think Sula has generally been recommended a lot on our Discord because it is accessible but really shows the power of what Morrison can do. Even though they are all very different, they have different topics, different atmospheres, but she does have this, as I say, this kind of unraveling mystery style, which I love and I think makes for a really rewarding reading experience. So yes, that was Beloved. Highly, highly recommend it. So I actually listened to all of the Broken Earth trilogy, and that is a testament to how great I found it once again, because that was hours and hours and hours of listening. So yes, in case you don't know, I wrote my master's dissertation on these books, so I'm very familiar with them, and yeah, I wanted to reread them this year. I wanted to buddy read them, and I enjoyed listening to them so much. In terms of the listening experience itself, I think the narrator was great. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I think the narrator did a great job. However, I'm not sure how well I would have got on if I didn't have some familiarity with the world. So you might be able to get away with listening to the first two books, but I really recommend reading the first book if you can, if you're reading it for the first time, because the third book brings in a lot of new ideas, new characters, new settings, so it's kind of worth reading it, I think, otherwise it might be confusing. But yes, once again, thankfully, considering I invested so much time into these, I found them to be just incredible. Really unique, fascinating, speculative fiction. I am still finding new stuff in here, even after the many rereads that I've done of these. I do think listening brought out new aspects of it as well, which is quite interesting. Probably should have listened to it before now. One of the things I really noticed this time about these books is how they build on one another. and how much you still discover in the third book, and how the story and the world kind of expands and grows. It's testament to Jemisin's writing style, or her process, I suppose, because she clearly had a very strong idea of the entire story when she started for the season. I think they came out successively, and I think she must have written them very quickly, successively, or maybe even as one big story that was then cut down into books. And you can really see that. I think it's a wonderful thing, and it doesn't always happen in fantasy series. The ideas in here are just unmatched. They are so good. I feel like I've read a lot of great speculative fiction in my time, but Jemisin just does new and exciting things. And yet at the same time, you can see hints of what's come before in the speculative fiction, fantasy and sci-fi. But she just does such unique things with this genre, and her imagination just knows no bounds here. And you know, I literally wrote thousands of words about it, and could probably write thousands more words about it. In the books, so I suppose I haven't really described the books. In the books, set in a place called the Stillness is constantly rocked by natural disasters, and every couple of hundred years there's something called a season, where it's essentially extremely life-threatening weather conditions, whether that be from like some super volcano erupting or whatever it might be. And at the beginning of this first novel, a season begins essentially, but it's been created, and it's been created by an origin. So origins in the Stillness are people that they have this sense of the earth, and they can manipulate the earth, so they can create volcanoes, they can quell earthquakes, which is such a cool concept to begin with. But it just grows and grows and grows and grows from there, and she really creates a whole history, a whole world. Her world building is great. People complain about all the different words and stuff at the beginning. There is a glossary in the back if you get really confused, but it does kind of become obvious, I think, after a little while. Yes, but anyway, origins are feared, they are oppressed as a result of their power. And so Jemisin does just incredible things with the depiction of this oppressed people here in such an alien world to ours, but really reflecting back our own world in this work. So it's extremely relevant, topical. She's looking at power, she's looking at race, she's looking at the family unit, she's looking at you know, how power functions, why power functions as it does. She's breaking down boundaries, you know, between human and non-human, not just human and animal, like human and non-human, like rock, stone, earth, things you think of as inanimate. She's breaking down the boundaries between us and those things, and really creating a different worldview in these books as a result. And that is why I wrote my dissertation on them, and why they are so wonderful. Her prose style is grating for some people. It's quite caustic, it's quite coarse, necessarily, because I think it matches the world she's creating. So are the characters. The protagonist particularly is a pretty prickly person. She is guarded and angry at the world and all sorts of things, and I know that people complain about her lack of character development. I think if you make it to the end of the whole series, you'll see why Jemisin makes the choices that she does. Again, I think that's why maybe people get stuck a little bit on the 5th season, the first book, but I really think it's worth, even if you like weren't super wowed by the 5th season, to keep going, because it really, like I say, just gets better and better, in my opinion. I don't think Jemisin is like the best prose stylist out there. I don't, you know, compared to many of the other authors that I read, the Baldwins, the Morrisons, the Le Guins, you know, of the world, she's not got my favourite prose style. But again, her ideas are incredible. I need to mention that. But also she does at least have a distinct style. She obviously writes with care. She obviously writes with precision. She uses second person throughout much of the novels, which again annoys some readers, but there is a good reason, and it's a reason that is very close to my heart. So the plot is kind of propulsive. I just love the world. I love reading about the world. I could read many more books set in this world. But yeah, the pacing is good, you know, and these are not like absolutely huge. Obviously it's quite a lot of pages when you read them back to back, but they're not huge books. She really does a lot in a compact, well-paced way. And finally, a surprise for me was how great it was to read Beloved and Broken Earth back to back, because both draw on the same historical references. You know, Jemison obviously draws on African American history and slavery, as does Beloved, obviously, is actually a historical novel. They both have really interesting things to say about life as an oppressed people, parenting, and the attack on the family unit of people under the yoke of slavery or oppression, and how those things function and how they play out. Both novels do that in possibly in extremely different ways. I mean, stylistically they are so different, but they had wonderful resonances across one another. It was really interesting to see like which parts Jemison really focused on and pushed, which parts Morrison really focused on and pushed, how they converged, how they diverged. Yeah, really fantastic to read them together. I wasn't expecting that at all because they're such different books, but I would kind of recommend reading them close to one another because I think they're really interesting together. Love them, read them, please. Thank you. Another wonderful reread for me was Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer, which was just amazing again. We read this for Books on Film, so I also rewatched the film. But yeah, I do worry sometimes that the books I recommend a lot and like not as good as I remember, but this is just as wonderful as I remember. If you haven't heard me talk about it before, it's narrated by the biologist. We don't know her name. And she's going into Area X, which is this phenomenon. Area of what is most definitely Florida has been surrounded by a strange alien border. And within the border, strange things are happening as well to the wildlife, to the landscape. And an organization called the Southern Reach keeps sending expeditions in basically to find out what's going on, but once they're in there, no communication can get in or out, and these expeditions basically just keep going missing. But just recently some members have been returning from Area X, but they don't know how they got back, and they're being weird, they're acting strange, and they are not very well. It's extremely unsettling, weird, strange, just really good kind of creepy vibes in this. It's not out and out horror, there are horror moments, but it's just got that really nice weird feel, which I find very satisfying. The first person narration is great because the biologist herself is pretty odd, and just the whole disjunct in the kind of like what you're seeing and what you expected to see is really strong here. Vandermeer handles it all perfectly, and I wanted to read the rest of the series again immediately when I finished this, but I do not have time. But yeah, all the wonderful hallmarks of Vandermeer are here. You know, the slippage again between the human and the non-human. Can you tell? I love it. The kind of undermining the fact that we have a scientist in there. It's a group of scientists. Actually, it's not a group of scientists. Some scientists anyway. The undermining of objectivity, the possibility of objectivity, you know, everything you know, everything you think you know, kind of slipping out of your control. All of that is here in Annihilation. Highly recommend it. Love it. This is some of Vandermeer's best work. More Morrison. I read Love by Toni Morrison, and this kind of follows two timelines. So in the present day, it follows two reclusive women living in this big house who are engaged in a decades-long feud over Bill Cozy, who was grandfather to one and husband of the other. And it's sort of over his estate, but it's also about what happened back then, about the secrets of the past, and of their memories, their shared memories, their memories of Bill Cozy. You know, all of this kind of stuff contributes to their feud. And in steps Junior, who she's just been released from correctional, and she's going to go and work for one of them, and she's going to take advantage of the situation with the two women. As one might expect, Morrison reveals to us over the course of the novel what happened in the past, what caused such bad blood between the women, and the legacy of Cozy, who owned this hotel, this resort on the beach, that was patronised by affluent African Americans during the 1950s. So the beginning feels almost thriller-like. We have this kind of strange cryptic opening from a character called Elle, who I think was one of my favourite characters in the book. She was the chef at the hotel. So another one of the women who had a relationship with Bill Cozy of a kind. And then, yeah, it feels almost like a thriller at the beginning. You're like, what happened here in the past? But then we relax into the different perspectives of the different women, and like I said, the kind of unraveling of the story. It's atmospheric, it's scenic, and its depiction of, you know, the town by the sea, and there's all the wonderful kind of Morrison things in here. The writing is great. There's a real feeling of vitality to it, to the characters. I wouldn't say this is my absolute favourite Morrison novel. I didn't feel quite as invested in the characters as I do with some of the others, for example Paradise or Sula, and I didn't love the ending, and I think it maybe needed either a little bit more expanding or a little bit more cutting, either to kind of make it even tauter or to flesh it out a little bit, particularly towards the end of the novel. But overall, fantastic. They're all worthy reads, the ones that I've read so far. And it is also great to see how each of her books speaks to the others. This one reminded me of Paradise in the kind of women in the house. Obviously also Beloved is a women in the house novel, but also it reminded me of Jazz, which is about two women feuding, or it includes two women feuding over a man, and yet they're all quite different as well. So another recommended novel from Morrison from me. And while we're talking about Morrison, let's just finish off with Rosita Teeth, which I will actually say correctly. This is the only short story that Morrison wrote, and I'm going to quote it again. It is an experiment in the removal of all racial codes from a narrative about two characters of different races for whom racial identity is crucial. So this immediately brought Paradise to mind, where Morrison does something similar, but in this, the experiment is the story. You know, it's the central pillar around which the story revolves, whereas Paradise has a lot of stuff going on. And of course, the experiment is on you, the reader. You know, it's asking you to try and work it out, but then it's asking you, why do you care to work it out? And then it's asking you, like, why you might pick this or that thing to make one character black, one character white. Ultimately, there is no answer to the question, at least not given to us by Morrison. She does a fantastic job of executing that. There's no wasted word here, you know, every scene has a purpose. Nonetheless, I love Morrison's longer work. She only wrote one short story, and I think she knew she was a novelist at heart, so I like to see how her plots move and come together. Obviously you don't get that in such a short little story. It's worth reading though, and I'm glad I read it, but yeah, I definitely just prefer her longer work. So this book was a lovely surprise. This is Death with Interruptions by Jose Saramago, and it's translated from the Portuguese, and it's about a country where death stops working. And I had in my head that this would be a challenging read, a dark read, perhaps kind of weird, like a precursor to the weird genre type of read, but it wasn't at all. Instead, it was quite funny. It wasn't light in a sort of trivial way, but it felt light to read, like kind of sitting lightly. It was quite touching. I just read briefly read the blurb of another of his novels, and it was called A Fable, and I think this one's not too dissimilar. It has a sort of fable-like feeling to it. Yeah, it was quite touching at times, and it was really, really clever. I mean, I could reread this and find so much more stuff in there. The theme's really interesting. Obviously the themes are life and death, and the way these function for us as humans. And the first half of the book really kind of focuses on the country as a whole. It has a kind of wider view. So we're looking at all the different industries that are suddenly thrown into turmoil by the end of death. So we've got the insurance companies, the undertakers are panicking, the mafia gets involved, obviously the old people's homes are panicking, the government is panicking. It has the government's reaction, the church's reaction. It has this run-on sentence style, which usually I just think is this totally necessary? But I think it really works in this book. It makes the novel flow. It draws us into the world. And this section was often quite funny. It was just interesting from a thought experiment level as well, as Sarah Margot works through all the different kind of paradoxes essentially that would happen if death stopped working, which sounds like it would be a good thing, but in fact would be probably a very, very bad thing. And the second half of the novel focuses on Death herself, so I won't go too much into her story, but it comes at just the right time when you're like, I wish I had a character to fix upon now. I wish I had a story, like a smaller, more intimate story, and I think it comes at just the right time. I loved the kind of contrast between this pragmatic, realistic style of what would the government do if death stopped working, and this more fantastical figure of death. She's wrought very beautifully, this skeletal character. It just adds a really fun, absurd feeling to the book. And Death is wonderful. I really liked her story, and I found the ending just quite touching and endearing, as I said. And I would really, really like to read more Sarah Margot in the future. I was very impressed by this and surprised by it, like I said. And I really, really recommend it. I think this would be enjoyed by a lot of people. So next up, Georgy Gospodinov's Time Shelter, which just won the International Booker. And this was a really interesting novel with lots of good things to like about it, but I can't say that I fully enjoyed the reading of all of it, and in fact through the middle section it took me a long time to get through it, comparatively, considering the page count. So I do think it was a worthy winner of the International Booker Prize though. I don't think necessarily it's supposed to be a page turner, whatever wins. You know, this has a lot of literary merit to it. It just maybe wasn't, it's not my kind of preferred style just generally in life. Yeah, it doesn't have the kind of propulsion of the type of narrative that I really, really tend to love. So yes, in it, a man called Ghostine invents time shelters, which are basically, he creates these buildings in which each room is a recreation of a year from the past, you know, meticulously recreated. People with dementia can go there and can really feel at home. You know, they don't feel at home in the present, they feel at home in the past, so it makes them feel at home. It brings something healing to them, and I think they actually do something similar to that in real life. But this sparks this dangerous wave of nostalgia which sweeps the whole of Europe, and this book in general feels very European, which is quite fun because I don't really read a lot of books that have that really European feel to them. And obviously Gospodinov here is referencing the waves of nostalgia that are moving across Europe, that are dangerous, kind of, you know, nationalism, far-right nationalism, and in the case of Gospodinov's home country, a nostalgia for the years of socialism as well. So in the end, all these countries hold referendums of the past and they decide which decade or which year they want to live in, and obviously this creates chaos in the process. So it's told in these short little vignettes and chapters. I don't know if you can see that, just they're quite, a lot of them are very short. And it has this loose storyline following our narrator, who actually, it turns out, may have written or created Ghostine in a kind of metafictional twist, which adds another layer of complexity to the book. But the narrator finds himself lost, basically. He has no nostalgic home except a very specific one. You know, he doesn't feel like he belongs to the nationalist movement or the socialist movement. So yeah, some of these little chapters are great, some of them less so. Particularly, it lost me kind of through the middle, like I said. Also, we lose Ghostine at one point, who is a really interesting character as well. I think we focus back on the narrator, which I was just like slightly less interested in the narrator. As I said, whilst I didn't really love the reading of this novel is infinitely quotable. There are so many fantastic lines in here, so many interesting takes on the concept of time, and I really think it's worth reading, but best to go into it knowing that it's probably not going to be a really kind of propulsive read. And based on the blurb, I thought it would be maybe almost like speculative fiction kind of thing about these homes of the past, but it's definitely more of a politically based narrative rather than really focusing on the recreation of the past or the time shelter concept. But yeah, I do think it's really worth reading, especially if any of that sounds appealing. Finally, a book I don't have, that's The Marriage Portrait by Maggie O'Farrell. Yes, it's coming in at the end of the video, everyone, because I didn't love it. I don't think Maggie O'Farrell is going to be for me. I'm going to try Hamnet at some point, but I could sort of tell she wasn't going to be an author for me. It's like I have spidey senses now about authors and books, and I sort of sense this about O'Farrell already. So this novel was just too messy for me. It was not taught or controlled enough. I've said it before, I'll say it again. Mantell has ruined me for historical fiction because she was just incredible at it, and she has the kind of style I like. So a lot of this is about stylistic taste, and for me, I felt like O'Farrell didn't know where she was taking me. It felt almost like a first draft, so it was like very free-flowing. I could tell she hadn't fully thought through where the book was going, and the full kind of plot line that she wanted to do. The symbolism was very heavy-handed at times, but I posted that on the Discord, and I can't remember who it was, so I'm sorry, but someone had recently watched a talk of O'Farrell, and she did confirm that is kind of the way she works. So that felt vindicating to me because I can feel it in her prose. I would say that Mosfegh is another author that works like that, and I prefer an author who has much more control, precision, with every single word carefully placed, sentences carefully structured, plot lines thought through. That's the kind of style I like, but I can see why people enjoy O'Farrell's style and Mosfegh's style. It annoys me as a reader. I don't get on with it very well. It just felt very wishy-washy, it didn't really feel like O'Farrell had a good grip on her subject matter, and she really twisted the history a lot. I'm happy to give my historical fiction writers a lot of leeway, but she twisted the history a little too much for me. Also, the ending really annoyed me, but whatever. As I kind of passed the 100-page point, I tried to say to myself, look, this is the style of this book. You must get past it and let it kind of wash over you. So I did let it wash over me, and I did make quicker progress from there and tried not to let my annoying little inner voice just whinge on, basically. And I do also think the plot picks up at this point. I don't think O'Farrell's handling of... So it's about Lucrezia de Medici. She was married off very young. Her sister died, who was betrothed to this guy, and then she was married off to him instead. And it turns out to be a cruel man. Basically, O'Farrell was inspired by the fact that she may or may not have been murdered by him. He kind of not covered up her death, but didn't allow her family to see her, etc., etc. She may or may not have been murdered by him. She's quite a sickly girl, so I really don't know what the actual truth is, but yeah, so that's what O'Farrell was inspired by. And yeah, I don't think she does a very good job of handling the childhood aspect of it at all. I think once we get into the marriage, it's a little quicker, it moves a bit better. But yeah, I was disappointed by it. It's not my style of book, and I will be wary of O'Farrell in the future. I don't think I'll be jumping into Hamnet. I would like to try it at some point because I know people do prefer it, but yes, just not for me. So I'm very sorry, all the O'Farrell fans out there. I know there's lots of you, but unfortunately I didn't get on with it very well. But anyway, my loves, thank you so much for watching today. That is everything, I think. I hope some of that made sense. I feel like there were some pretty complex books in here, and I probably didn't do them justice. I'm already excited to talk to you about my August books. I think there's going to be some great ones in there. So yes, thank you so much for watching today, and I will see you again very soon.